All right, here we go. Starting on the bottom of page 288. This is 11.4. Moving quickly to 289 here. So talk about conservation biology takes a lot into account when it's doing its research. It's talking about field data. It's talking about the lab data. Talking about theory, talking about experiments. It studies a whole bunch of things from genes to species to ecosystems. It takes a whole bunch of stuff into account. Basically, think of conservation biology as doing kind of environmental science, but all that science work we kind of briefly talk about, they're diving into all of that stuff. So they study genetic variation to determine when we need to intervene to repopulate a species. So if the genetic variation is low, the issue becomes, where basically you can get what's called an inbreeding depression is what goes on, where basically the parents are going to produce an offspring that's just not viable, basically. Like they're not going to survive very well. They're not very strong. You know, they can't hunt very well, stuff like that. So we need the genetic variation to be high enough for that to happen. So they study that in order to see kind of when we need to intervene to help them out. Now moving to page 290. Nope, sorry, I'm off the screen a little bit. So the Endangered Species Act, this is what really kind of gives the conservation biologist kind of like its teeth per se. So the main driving force in conservation biology is also very successful. And we've talked about this a while ago. Endangered Species Act is so awesome because it makes recovery plans for everything. So recovery plans have made it so for every one animal that is added to the endangered species list, 3 are removed, which is a really good success rate. However, that's not entirely the whole story, because the funding for the ESA ran out. I think it says it right there. It expired in 1992. So every single year, Congress has to give them more money, but it's always kind of a back and forth, back and forth. One of the things they talk about, you can see it right under here, is that some species are warranted but precluded, meaning that their listing is warranted by scientific research, but precluded by lack of resources. And it's definitely a frustrating thing to have happen. Now, most people think the ESA is a really good thing. Like the polls have shown that everybody likes it. But in some places, people don't like it. It's actually kind of an interesting thing because they talk about here in the Pacific Northwest, the logging industry, because the northern spotted owl and the marblered murrelet, I think I'm saying that right, basically made it so that if they find those 2 species on the land, they can't harvest the timber there. So a thing they started talking about or started doing is this thing called shoot, shovel, and shut up. Basically, they want to conceal the presence of such species on their land, because if they find that species, the whole logging industry in that area will shut down. So they've started to kind of, and if you want to read the kind of these next 2 paragraphs, it's kind of interesting. Kind of they come to some sort of an agreement between the landowners, which is good, but not everybody's happy, which is not surprising. All right, 291. So the CITES, and we talked about this a while ago as well, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. So the CITES, as well as the Convention on Biological Diversity, have both helped poorer nations maintain biodiversity and save species. So they basically are making it an international thing, that like the trade of stuff is no longer allowed, because the poorer nations realized it was bad, but they just simply didn't have the resources to combat it. So by basically kind of getting the international community involved in this stuff, they make it so that way like the ecotourism dollars can go to these countries to help save them. Next thing I wrote, captive breeding works. Some people hate this stuff, but it has been demonstrated to work. The condors are a perfect example of this. Basically, back in the day, they literally took all of the wild condors, and we're talking like, I don't even know, 20, 30 of them, something like that. They took all the wild condors, pulled them into captivity to breed them. So you can see condors in captivity is the red, condors in the wild is the orange. So basically you can see we pulled them all in, and then basically the condor population has been increasing. Another thing that they talk about a lot, they talk about, oh, we can just do cloning. That's a really good thing. Not so much. Because if you clone an animal and then you clone it again and again and again and again, you have zero genetic diversity. Another issue is that cloning, our technology, just isn't good enough yet. And typically the cloned animals don't survive. One picture I love, and I just think it's kind of a weird picture because basically they're transporting these rhinos. And basically what they did, they transported 2 rhinos back to the Serengeti National Park to help restore a former population that was there, and it worked. But just simply the way that they carry them, I just think is so weird. But it's actually really safe. All right, 292. So 292, so forensics is now being used to track where the meat is coming from to determine if illegal trade is occurring. So the image down here on the bottom, they're basically selling whale meat, but the forensics has basically been analyzing a whole bunch of stuff to basically figure out, A, where it's coming from. That's a really important part to see if they're like breaking any international treaties, but also determine if it's simply the meat that it's labeled as being. Like they found a bunch of stuff that's been labeled to be whale meat that's like dolphins and other things like that. 293, talking about these umbrella and flagship species. So by protecting them, that means lots of other organisms are protected too. So lions, these guys are an example of an umbrella species. So they need vast, large areas for their habitat. So if you can protect them and their large habitat areas, you're automatically taking care of other species that rely on that area as well. Now, pandas on the flip side are what's called a flagship species. So they can also be considered an umbrella species, and lions can be flagship, but they're kind of 2 different categories. Basically, you protect them, umbrella, a whole bunch of other species are protected by taking care of them. A flagship is more kind of, think of it as like kind of like a marketing ploy or scheme or strategy. So basically, if you take care of pandas or kind of use pandas as a flagship species, because everybody likes pandas, everybody loves pandas, they're great, they're so cuddly, stuff like that. It's the same thing, like this image shows, the term shows the ring-tailed lemur. And what this is talking about is basically like the image to the left there is talking about like biodiversity hotspots. But this is a good example of a flagship species as well. Everybody loves lemurs. They're super cool. They're super cute. We're in a Disney movie, so automatically they love everybody. So they are one that can kind of, everybody can kind of get behind and rally behind. You know, you're not gonna put like a, like a dung beetle on there and everybody get like go behind and donate millions of dollars to it. You need something that everybody kind of like really has like an affinity for. All right, this science behind the species, pretty interesting actually. Talking about the forensic DNA analysis helping to save the elephants. So the image down here, what they're basically doing, you can see the forest elephant reference sites. So basically they know where what the DNA evidence or the DNA samples look like from there, then estimated origin of the ivory sample. So when they confiscate ivory, they can basically narrow down where it probably came from. Same thing over here. They're basically narrowing down where this stuff is coming from, which is kind of a cool way to do this. All right, 296. So community-based conservation. You can see it's right there. Okay, basically in the past, a lot of this stuff is like all the biologists and conservation biologists and stuff like that, kind of to protect the wildlife, always came from a richer nation and was more kind of like imposed upon the poorer nation. So they kind of felt like basically it was like kind of the old school, the neo-colonialism. Basically, you're kind of like just telling them what to do. So what I wrote down here is basically community-based conservation is similar to community policing. You basically need to get the local community involved, because by getting them involved, the overall goal of taking care of the conservation, taking care of species and taking care of the ecosystems that are involved typically helps. Now, this can be difficult though. So, for example, and they talk about it kind of right here, down here at the bottom and onto the next page. They're talking about basically making the Serengeti National Park. So residents were forcibly relocated. By some estimates, 50,000 Maasai were evicted to create Serengeti National Park. In the view of many local people, the parks were a government land grab, and laws against poaching deprived them of a right to kill wildlife. And so, like I said, it's not just, it's kind of like we had this years ago with like the Native Americans here in Washington. They wanted to go whaling, but that's against some laws here. But they thought this is part of our tradition and whatnot. So it was kind of a big fight, and that's kind of the deal with this. Typically, you kind of need the locals to work with you, but getting them on board can be difficult. All right, let me know if you have questions.